Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on creating an effective roadmap for Microsoft 365. We'll give a couple seconds here and wait for some people to show up over the next minute. We'll start sharply at 10 a.m. Okay, well, thanks for coming today. Just some quick housekeeping. There's a Q&A panel that you can use to ask questions and make comments, and we'll respond to those as we go. And we will have a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel that will be made available probably by tomorrow. So if you miss anything, don't worry about taking notes. You can always refer back to the recording. What we'll cover today, so you've actually done a lot of recent roadmaps for a lot of clients, and especially those who maybe needed to rush into Microsoft 365 in response to the pandemic. And so a good chance to maybe take a step back and look at how do we move things forward, or maybe you're starting that journey and you need to figure out how do we effectively, move forward with implementation in a very thoughtful and deliberate fashion. So we're going to look at the principles that we use for building roadmaps, how to develop a roadmap, some technical Microsoft 365 considerations, and then how to keep it alive and evolve it and make it relevant and keep it useful over time. So first, some introductions. So that's me, Michael Schweitzer. I'm the CEO and president of Gravity Union. Lots of fun stats about me there over on the right. And then today, I'd like to introduce Jazz Shakla, who will be doing the webinar today.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm really excited to be doing this. I'm going to share my video, hopefully, so you can see me as well. And let's see, that'll work here. Actually, I don't think it's going to let me do that. So you'll just have to rely on my picture there. I'm really excited to be joining, and I've worked on a number of roadmaps over my career. So I've been doing this for about 15 years now in both the product space and in the Microsoft 365 consulting space. So it's interesting for me to see roadmaps from both points of view. It's a really fun experience to go through, I think, as a team. And one of these things that I find really inspiring and sets a team up for success. So I'm hoping you can ask some questions today and get some good value out of this session. Who we are at Gravity Union, we are a compliance-inspired services company. So we do compliance, information management, records management. That's the heart. A lot of times the heart of what we do, in addition to collaboration on the Microsoft 365 platform. We're spread across Canada. I'm actually in Moncton, so I'm on the other side of the country. We are based in Vancouver. And we are a close Microsoft partner. And one of the things that helps with in terms of roadmaps is it gives us some insight into what's coming from Microsoft, what's coming in the platform, as well as being able to get a sneak peek and give some feedback into that roadmap. So we're honored and proud to be a content services partner, and this helps us with some of the bleeding edge technology, things like Viva Topics, Syntax, if you've heard about that. And just some fun stats about Gravity Union. One of the ones that stands out to me here is we've migrated quite a few documents, and we guess about 50 million documents in our solution. So that's a fun stat for us to keep up to date. So I'm going to get into this topic today. So let's talk about roadmaps. I always like to start with why. Why are we spending the time investing and building roadmaps? And one of the primary reasons that I see and I find a lot of value in is having a roadmap as a communication tool. You might need it in different formats, and I'll show you some examples of that. Depending on who you're talking to, you might need it in a different format to build alignment and get buy-in. It's also a great guide to help manage change in an organization. Microsoft 365 changes often, as you probably know, and so this can help inform some of that change and help us adjust to the change. And another reason too is that platform is really big. There's a lot of different services, features, functionality, and a roadmap helps us focus to make sure we are focused on the use cases that add the most value, maximize our investment in the platform. And I do kind of see this sort of like planning a trip or planning a vacation. Hopefully we'll get back to doing that soon. But we often, when we think about planning a vacation or planning a road trip, we make a list of all the things we want to do and sort of a wish list, a clipboard of fun, I like to call it. And a roadmap is similar in that it gives us inspiration. It gives us ideas, a place to focus, a place that we want to go forward in our journey. It also helps us, talk to other people about that trip, helps us get inspired and excited and share in that with other people. So let's get into what is a roadmap. I know that this term is used frequently in different contexts, and sometimes different images or different ideas come into mind when you say roadmap. So one of the very common typical things that people think of when you say roadmap, especially in this space, in the Microsoft 365 space, is you think of something like this, a bunch of boxes, maybe on a one-pager. They're grouped into themes or experiences, sort of bundling different value for your end users or your employees. And often they're on a timeline. This one doesn't have a specific timeline, but there's some high-level phases that you see. And another really common one here, it's a little bit more wordy. You might see something like this, got lots of words on it. Maybe some general streams of work, things like change management, or maybe there's some technical things that have to happen, different activities. They can also be less formal. So I've done roadmaps like this, just spend an afternoon in a meeting room when we could work together. I love working with sticky notes. It helps keep 3M in business, and I do find them very tactical, very easy to move around and have a discussion around. So just putting things up on a whiteboard, working with your team, that can be an option for sure, and using that as your jumping off point for your roadmap. This was one I did a number of years ago, very detailed roadmap. So you sometimes see them in Excel and there's lots of words, and you break out, different parts of the solution that you want to ultimately deliver. For example, maybe you're looking at an employee portal or an intranet as part of your roadmap, and you want to break that out so that you can help communicate different components of it, different value that employees will get from that employee portal. So and maybe you want to call out content, maybe you want to call out governance. So different themes and different areas can be called out the more details you get. And these can sometimes be time consuming, but they are sort of a useful point to help everyone understand the direction and a useful sort of starting point. To me, though, they are more than just a one-pager, a thing that you put up on a wall or put in a PowerPoint. They answer a lot of critical questions. And one of the key ones you want to look at is what business problems are you solving for? You want to start from that place of making sure you understand why a Microsoft 365 solution is useful and the rationale. What services, so sometimes this is referred to as workloads, or there's different technology bits. You want to think about that or infuse those services into your roadmap. And depending on your organization, you may work in a project-based mode. It's very common. You have to, present projects, present a plan, get some budget for that project. And so it could be important in your roadmap to think about how to break it up into projects. And when to engage different groups and departments. We find this is really important so that people know when they need to make some free time to work on Microsoft 365, when they might need to be involved to give feedback or to try out things. How long? This is a very typical one in a roadmap, is you want to get a sense of timing on projects. Sometimes as well, you want to get into budget conversations depending on how your committee is approaching Microsoft 365 and if some budget planning needs to happen for the future years. This can be a good place to start that conversation too. And then there's some technology components that sometimes come up into roadmaps. For example, you want to highlight any extensions, any third-party tools you might need, so that you can make sure that that solution meets your needs. Maybe it's around security or compliance, and you need to add on those third-party tools. And products and technology that we're replacing, sometimes that can be part of the business justification of doing Microsoft 365, is making sure you're covering where other products or other technologies can be phased out. So some of those elements, maybe that's part of your one-pager that I just gave you some examples of, and maybe it's not. But generally a roadmap, you need to build it to suit the information that your stakeholders are going to need. And I'm going to talk about how to build a roadmap and the process that we typically go through and that I've gone through in my career. But I want to also highlight, before I get into that process, just some principles I've sort of learned along the way and things that I've reflected on as we build roadmaps. So first principle, guiding principle number one, is that roadmaps are a living document. They're not things that hopefully stay static. They're not a contract saying all of these things will be delivered in a certain amount of time. Generally, a good roadmap, an effective roadmap, is a statement of direction, of intent. Like I said, when I talked about planning for a vacation, it is an inspiration and a guide for that vacation or for Microsoft 365. And it will likely change once you get to your destination or you're living this roadmap. There will be things added or removed as you go. So I like to think of it as a living document. The next principle is to focus on outcomes, not technology, not all of the features and bits. You want to focus on, I find the effective ones focus on themes and value propositions based on use cases from your organization. It's more than just a list of technologies and sort of when things will be implemented. OneDrive goes live here and Teams goes live here. You want to think more use case based. People can manage projects at this point, or people have community sites or community workspaces at this point. So you want to think about those use cases, value propositions, and bundle those things into themes that resonate for your organization. I also put my product hat on when I'm thinking about roadmaps too. So I do think about releases and what's going to be really useful for end users or employees and bundling those things into useful delivery points or almost launches. Think of them as mini launches. So that's really helpful. If you think of your roadmap as a living document, you think of it as it's never really over, but these bundled releases are going to be constantly released. It's sort of continuous improvement, if you will. And another tip, and I'll show you an example of this too, is to add quick wins. To get momentum on your roadmap and continued investment, it is helpful to highlight some quick wins early on. And like I said, you're never done. So I do think of these things as like a product, not necessarily always project-based where there's a beginning and an end, but these are things that you're going to be maintaining. Microsoft 365 changes all the time. And so think of these as sort of products that you're constantly evolving, making sure they're useful for your organization. And in that vein, what I recommend is don't go too fancy with the tool that you're using for the roadmap and the communication. I use PowerPoint. I really like PowerPoint, especially for presenting in different formats. If I need more detail, perhaps I'll put Excel, but not usually. And another tool that I'm finding teams find really helpful is Planner. So if you're already using Microsoft 365 and maybe you're taking a step back and building out a more strategic roadmap, one place to do that is Planner. So they don't need to be really fancy. Planner is really great for moving things around, assigning ownership, and that sort of thing. And the fourth principle is to just think about these as two mindsets. So you have a technology angle, and like I said, it's not just about the technology, but there will be some places where you're highlighting services. And so it's important to have a technology stream, perhaps in your roadmap. But I also like to think of it as sort of a storytelling or change management mindset. And that's important because, like we all know, it changes all the time. The platform changes, and you want to make sure that communication, training, and change management is baked into that roadmap. And the last principle I have, this one is very specific to Microsoft 365, is think about this as enable first. So you're enabling a bunch of services and not disabling everything out of the gate. So it's not disable everything and we turn on things slowly. We want to enable as much as we can from the beginning. And that's because Microsoft 365 is highly interconnected, it's highly dependent. The different services behind the scenes are designed to work together. And when a lot of elements get turned off, unexpected things can happen, whether it's in Teams or Power Apps or other places. Teams, for example, is highly dependent on OneDrive for sharing files. So when you're chatting with people, you can share files, and that relies on OneDrive. And another place you might have heard as well, when you're creating new team workspaces or teams and channels, that does rely on SharePoint behind the scenes. So you want to also make sure you plan for having these services enabled and having them supported as well. So just as a recap, the guiding principles I mentioned, it's a living document. You're focusing on outcomes. You're never done. It's constantly evolving. There's sort of a two mindset approach to these things. There's technology and change management. So you're telling a story as well over time. And enable first. So this is very specific to Microsoft 365. You want to think about enabling as many services as you can out of the gate. So I'm going to take a little side journey here. I have been working on roadmaps almost since the start of my career. And when earlier on, a couple years in, and I was doing a number of these, and I had a crisis because I just was wondering, does anyone use these things? We build these 2 or 3 year roadmaps. Generally speaking, I didn't see many organizations or many product teams I was part of, sticking to what was going to happen on year 2 or sticking to what was going to happen in year 3. And it got, a little bit demoralizing. So stepping back, something that I had to remind myself of and, make sure I understood the goal of roadmaps is the goal is not to implement everything on a roadmap. I think of these things, and I've mentioned it a couple times, as a guide or an inspiration. And people choose their destinations over time. And adventures will change. Our desires, our preferences, they change over time too. And that's okay. One of the great things about roadmaps is it brings people together early on. Hopefully, if you haven't started on Microsoft 365, this is your chance to bring your stakeholders together. And if you are down the path and you've started, it can be helpful and refreshing almost to step back and to look at, okay, what are the most important use cases or scenarios that we need to enable? And also another thing that I've looked at and I've started to implement in roadmaps is looking at certainty or looking at confidence. How confident are we about delivering all of these things? And making that clear to stakeholders and especially executives that we don't have 100% certainty or we don't have 100% confidence that everything in here is going to be delivered. Typically, you have more certainty with anything that is 1 or 2 quarters out, or even this year in year 1, you have more certainty, and you have less certainty over things that are farther down. So this is from my product experience. I took this example from the internet because I'm not allowed to share any sort of product roadmaps I've worked on. But it's very common, and I'm finding it more common for companies and organizations to share how confident they are in delivering things on a roadmap. So you still have, themes and, buckets of value essentially that you're communicating in the roadmap. You have very specific items you might be listing. And maybe it's a live roadmap. You're keeping it live with status. You're sharing if it's in progress or not. And you're sharing what timeline you expect to deliver something. But one of the columns here that I really like is this confidence one over on the far right-hand side. And that's illustrating whether you feel a high level of confidence, medium, or low level of confidence that this will be delivered. And again, this communicates to management stakeholders sort of realistic expectations of, is this going to be delivered sort of in the time that we expect it to? And I used to do something like this as well in sharing reports or monthly reports to different management or stakeholder teams, is sharing a list of things that we're 100% confident in, maybe things that we're 70 or 80% confident in that are going to be next quarter, and then sharing things that we're 50% confident in next year. And that sets the expectation that not everything in this list, again, will be delivered. And that's okay. We're going to have discussions about priority. We're going to have discussions about the rationale behind things. And this, I find, this model or this way of talking about the roadmap can be helpful in having those conversations. So now that I've given you a little bit of the principles behind roadmaps, giving you some, a few high-level examples, I want to get into the details and the step-by-step process of building out a roadmap. And I do find these things are worth the time and effort. And so even if you take 1 or 2 things from this process, that's great. You don't have to do them all step by step. I'm sort of showing you the ideal step-by-step process, but hopefully this gives you an idea for things that you could take with you. So our general process here at Gravity Union, it's a 3-step process, and we first go through an assessment or a current state assessment. That usually takes, depending on the organization we're working with and how many people we might be talking to, it takes a week or 2. Then we work on envisioning the future. So after we, understand the current state, understand the problems, we talk about the future, and that is generally a session, and I'll go through sort of what we covered in that session. But it could be a couple hours, could be half a day, could be a whole day, just depending on how many people are involved in that visioning session. And then we iterate and then we build. And this has a wide time range. It can take a week, it could take a couple weeks. It just depends on how many iterations we're going through. Are we creating different versions for different audiences? And also, are we doing some more detailed work, say to get estimates or to break things out into projects? And this is where I find it's helpful to bring in your favorite project manager, and they can help you build that roadmap and plan. And so overall, the process could take 3 to 4 weeks, or it could take as much as 8 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that. And that'll just depend on how fast people can get stuff in their schedules, how many people are involved. And I'll walk through now each step of this so you get a sense of what's involved. And so let's talk about the assessment. And so I should mention as well, I do treat these roadmaps as almost a project with a beginning and an end, just because you want to tell people all the activities you're going to be doing. You want to give people a sense of dates so they can plan for it. And so having a kickoff is helpful. In that assessment, in this assessment piece in that first week or two, we also want to share a little bit about Microsoft 365, and that's where we call the Art of the Possible briefing to level set with everyone. And then the bulk of the work here in the assessment phase is baseline survey, so do a survey to people, and that's which is optional if we feel it's useful, and do some interviews. So interviews with stakeholders, employees is what I like to do to make sure we're getting perspective from different groups. And so if you want to level set with people about Microsoft 365, I do find it's helpful to focus on scenarios. So think about the scenarios that are really common in your organization. And usually I always use the example of projects and project management. Typically, most organizations have that as a scenario. And so focus Microsoft 365 demos or show and tell on those scenarios. And at a high level, you want to talk about teamwork and collaboration scenarios, forms and business process. So anytime people are using workflows or systems in your organization, maybe there's an opportunity to highlight how those could be accomplished in Microsoft 365 and show examples of that. And security and compliance. Those are the general buckets, just to level set so everybody has an expectation of what's in the platform. And if you can highlight what's coming out, it's a lot of things usually, but if there's relevant things in the roadmap, you want to highlight that. And a survey is really an optional thing, like I said, but it can be helpful to get a baseline of what some of the business problems are, what some of the challenges are in your organization. And I also find them helpful if you are recruiting for interviews. If you're looking for people to participate in some current CIT-8 assessment interviews, this could be the place to ask if they'd be willing to do it. And I do like to have a couple different types if we are doing surveys. So there's the stakeholder version and the end user version. The stakeholder one is usually if you have a committee or somebody, a group of people planning for Microsoft 365, you want to get them thinking about the ROI or the reasons for investing in Microsoft 365, and you want to get that out of their heads. So a survey is one way to do that. Also talking to them, of course. But I do find laying things out with multiple choice gives people some options and maybe some thoughts of why this might be useful, maybe things of they haven't thought of before. And generally with a survey, I should also mention, if you can, wherever you can, have some multiple choice options as much as possible. People don't like filling out blank answers necessarily, so it's helpful to seed some ideas and thoughts in this. Technology, this is another example of asking about pain points and that sort of thing. What I find it's the most valuable in this phase is focusing on the interviews. These are some questions. You'll have the slides afterwards, and so you'll have some examples or maybe some ideas for questions to ask your stakeholders. But I do like to talk about the business reasons, the rationale for moving to Microsoft 365, and also to get a sense of the technology landscape. This is a good opportunity to dive deep into those systems that may or may not be used or may not be adopted, and to understand why. And then employee input. I do like to have some sessions with representatives from across an organization in different departments or different roles or different tenure if possible. People that are new to the organization or people that have been there for a while, just to understand how people work, what their challenges are typically around searching for information or saving or collaborating with other people. And a lot of this time, because we've been in this mode where we're working remotely and working across screens, I'm finding it is helpful to work remotely for these types of interviews. And that's because you can share your screen and you can ask follow-ups. Show me how, the challenge that you're facing there. Walk me through how you might. And this gives you, again, for the roadmap, ideas for those useful themes, those useful buckets that you're going to put into that roadmap. So spending a little time doing this, it doesn't have to take long, 1 to 2 days at most, is really helpful to get some insight as you go into that visioning phase with the rest of your stakeholders. So, take some time, summarize your themes and findings, just break it into simple issues and opportunities. It's a good place to start. If we are adding more end user context, or you want to talk about the mindset of people in the organization, talking about personas or presenting journey maps can be helpful for that. I'm not going to get into that too much. It's probably a whole other session, but there's lots of information online if you're looking for inspiration for that. So visioning, that's the next step in creating a great roadmap. And this is where things start to get a little bit more real. People are talking about the future, and you want to think about the mix of stakeholders that you have as part of this. Hopefully you have representatives not only from technology or IT, but also anyone else that is involved in communicating about technology, anyone else that's going to get benefit. So top departments, typically maybe HR, maybe finance, people that are going to get some benefit from the platform. Not too big and not too small. It's sort of the Goldilocks rule, but you want to get a variety of input if you can. So in this workshop, we level set, we discuss all the findings from the interviews. So if you've done the interviews or the survey from the previous step, you gather that all up, you share that back. You could give people a pre-read. I like to do that. And then we talk about any questions or anything that was surprising in this workshop. And so we just make sure we understand the current state. Then we spend some time brainstorming. There's different ways to do that. You could ask different questions. I do like to ask, give people a minimum number of things to sort of think about. Is any new opportunities, so 5 new opportunities for Microsoft 365. If you can, get people to think about it from other points of view, other audience or user groups, and then be prepared to share. So I do this live in the session. Everybody has time to brainstorm, to write down their ideas. And if you're doing it remotely, it's not too bad, actually. I've been experimenting with different tools, and now I just use PowerPoint because I love PowerPoint so much. But I just write it down on these yellow squares as people are talking. I show a slide. I move these squares around as people are talking. As ideas come up and they're repeated, or maybe multiple people have the same idea, I'll just use a red dot or something like that to indicate that, so you get a sense of how many ideas are repeated and all of that. And if you can, break it into themes. If you can't, or you don't have time, that's okay. Just depends how long your workshop is. But you just want to, the goal here is just to get those ideas out of people's heads and to write it down. And if you can, as part of this workshop, prioritize, I use a scale of impact versus difficulty. So you're looking for things that are high impact and low difficulty. So that's what that greenish circle there is. And so you want to group things in there, and those will feed into your roadmap. Those will be ideas possibly for quick wins or things you want to do early on. And then you're also looking for places where there's going to be higher impact, but maybe it's a higher level of difficulty as well. And these are guesses. Nothing here is scientific, but those could be longer term projects that you have in your roadmap. So simple exercise, a simple visioning workshop. Generally, I find the time flies. Hopefully people have fun as they're going through it, because it is fun to imagine that future. And this is just a close-up view of some of the results. So you can see sometimes people are thinking about specific workspaces or sites or types of things, leadership, project teams, community sites, all those things come up. And so you're just taking notes as people are saying those items. And so the last phase, now you're building it. Now you're drafting, putting together that roadmap in whatever tool you choose, whatever's easy for you to use. Typically, roadmaps require a few iterations. As you talk to other folks, you're going to iterate, and so make it easy to update, easy to change. You might have to do an estimate And you might have to also think about how you're going to present it in different formats. You might need the one-pager view, and then maybe you have the planner view for the project team. And so this is also where I have some thoughts as well about Microsoft 365. There's a number of dependencies, as you probably are aware if you've been down the path of Microsoft 365. And so generally, there is some technology considerations woven into the roadmap. And typically what we see here is that early on, if people are starting out with Microsoft 365, they're starting with identity, they're starting with the Office apps. Then they're moving into mail, moving into Exchange Online. That can be a longer, more complex effort depending on what system you're using. So that is an initiative that deserves perhaps its own place on the roadmap as well. And then another really early thing that we recommend is just setting your base security posture. Maybe you don't have time to figure out everything in security and compliance in Microsoft 365. And that's totally understandable. It's a very large product or feature suite. But we do, at a high level, we want people to figure out Azure Active Directory, come up with the base sort of configuration for that, as well as sharing links and multi-factor authentication. Those are another couple of things that you want to figure out early on. Are links allowed to be shared externally to your organization or not? And then think about how people are going to authenticate in. And there's, this ... here, because there's a lot of different things you could break out into security. And I'm not an expert by any means, but these are a few high-level things that you want to put on your roadmap for early quick wins. And then Microsoft Teams, that's a big product suite as well. People, often want to launch that really early on, which is great. And we've seen in this pandemic era as well, Microsoft Teams being rolled out quickly to enable remote work. And so thinking about, if you haven't gone on that journey yet, thinking about what you want to enable in Teams, we usually see meetings and chat with OneDrive enabled first. That's a very popular way to start. If you can, start with the entire suite. I think it's helpful to get learnings and to understand how people want to work, but without the sprawl. So there's a tricky balance, and it's going to be different for every organization. So think about how you want to roll that out. And then what we see is a longer tail in the roadmap of people moving content to the cloud, and that's in a combination of SharePoint in Teams, as well as thinking about classification and compliance. And that tends to be farther in the roadmap, but all of this is a really important element of the roadmap as well. So that's just a high level. I know I said roadmaps are not technology lists. It's not a laundry list of technology, but it is woven through in your use cases, in the business problems you're trying to solve, is that you want to address some of the top technology questions. And this is sort of that general gradual approach to Microsoft 365. And as I said earlier, because Teams is special and you want to enable a bunch of services with Teams, because it is dependent on other aspects of Microsoft 365. So if you haven't started yet, be prepared to manage groups, SharePoint sites, OneDrive for Business, mailboxes. And if you are thinking about meeting recordings, Stream is a really helpful place for that. So think about how you want to manage Stream. And as I mentioned projects a few times. Planner, we're finding, is a really popular element of Microsoft 365. And so think about enabling that too. It's a really helpful way for people to work and share tasks and assign accountability all within Teams. And so another part about building a roadmap, so not only thinking about the technology, is also thinking about how you're going to present it, like I've said. So I'll show you a few examples. So a timeline, very, very common, one-pager timeline. So this one is based on a couple years. It's spread out over quarters, so quarters are highlighted. You see a bunch of different colored boxes. There's a legend down there. It was important for this client to understand what's a planning project versus what's a pilot versus what's an org-wide rollout. And we do recommend pilots. So thinking about your roadmap in terms of let's release some functionality, some use cases to people early, but in a limited way. So to help mitigate any sprawl issues or any governance issues, let's do a pilot first and get some learnings. So that's helpful to illustrate in a roadmap, we find. It helps executives and sponsors to understand who's going to see these things initially and then who sees them later. You might want to group things that belong together. Maybe if there's dependencies sort of in the details, you want at a high level, maybe surface where those dependencies are. And then highlight quick wins. So we just use stars here. Just highlight things that we believe are going to be high impact. So going back to that prioritization workshop, places where you think are going to have high impact, maybe you want to highlight that. Another really simple way of presenting it, instead of this timeline, sort of looking at these small boxes on a screen, maybe it's just a simple, 3 columns, 3 phases. And so here's an example of different phases of Microsoft 365 roadmap. First, there's a planning phase, then there's some quick wins, and then there's longer term strategic projects. And so here's some examples, and you can see the different types of things that are going to be enabled in each phase. And so naming these phases, grouping these phases, we find can be a useful way of sponsors or executives to understand a roadmap. And I have a confidence example as well. This is very similar to that first one I showed you, which is showing roadmaps by stream in different bundles of releases, essentially, or streams of work. So you'll have maybe a security stream of work, collaboration, governance, business process or workflow stream of work, and training and change management. And so maybe in the first half of the year, you're confident, you're 90 or 99% confident you're going to deliver these things. And then in the second half of the year, you're less confident. So you're showing the things that maybe 4 out of the 5 items on this list are going to be delivered. And then next year, 50% confident. So just, presenting them in different ways can help people understand the roadmap depending on what their priority is, what they care about. And so it's a useful way to think about breaking up your roadmap. As well, what we find is with organizations very heavily focused on projects, and there's a start and an end to projects. You can think about, we just present sometimes these 1-page estimates for each project. So for each box on the roadmap or each item, estimating it, describing it, giving people more detail that want it. This is not necessarily something that is on that 1-pager. This can be supplemental info to help a committee or to help a budget team sort of plan for what's coming. So to recap, the process here, I recommend for building a roadmap, follow these steps. It takes a bit of effort, takes a bit of time and planning, but it is well worth it to then guide your organization and focus on the most important things that you want to deliver in Microsoft 365. So I'll spend the last few minutes here just talking about how to evolve the roadmap, how to keep it fresh for your teams, for your project teams, for your technology teams. So staying on top of Microsoft 365, really important. If you've been using it, you probably get message center notifications if you're an admin, or maybe you're subscribed to a feed. There are some ones out there that summarize all of the changes that are happening. For example, this Office 365 Weekly Digest. You want to share these changes, obviously, with your power users, with your admins. Admins are probably already subscribed to them. And I'll show a quick example here. We put this in our own Teams environment. At Gravity Union, we have this channel, Microsoft Updates, and that's where all of the notices that are going to the message center or that are part of this weekly digest are shared. So anybody that's interested can just subscribe to that or have that in their list. What we do to try to make this useful, and what I'm seeing some organizations do now, is that there is this feature in Microsoft 365 admin that ties the message center notifications into Planner. So if you have a Planner board connected to that message center, the notices will automatically show up in a column or in a bucket that you specify. For example, not yet assigned. And so if your roadmap is stored in Planner, you can have these feed in, and then as part of your regular review of your roadmap, maybe you're reviewing it weekly or bi-weekly, your team can discuss what parts of the Microsoft 365 changes are relevant to add to the roadmap. Maybe there's ones you can ignore, so you can just remove them. Maybe there's ones that need to be assigned to somebody to do something, and so those can be assigned within Planner. So that's another helpful way, just a tip for staying on top of the changes that are happening in the platform. And if you want to preview changes, so you want to see what's coming and look at the feature, understand how it works, you may not have seen this already, but within Microsoft 365, there's a way to target those changes, those early releases to specific groups. So you might want to target it to help desk, for example, or to help desk and your roadmap team. Maybe they need to preview those changes. So you're going to target those. People can play with it and they can decide how this is going to impact the roadmap. And then everyone else in your organization would be on the standard release and they would see things at a later point. So I mentioned communication and training and change management as part of your roadmap. And so one way that we find is really helpful is making sure communications is involved in the roadmap development, but also in sharing the roadmap. So they're part of the planner board. They understand what's changing, what's coming, and they can help communicate that out to the rest of your organization. And learning pathways is a great way for staying or presenting fresh training materials. One of the things that's really hard I found in the past with SharePoint and Microsoft 365 is stuff changes. Maybe you've recorded a training video and now you have to re-record it because the UI is different or things have changed. One of the benefits now that Microsoft's providing is learning pathways, and that's essentially a set of playlists. It's a training playlist for different products, for different scenarios, and you can add it to your SharePoint environment, to your employee portal, and it will stay up to date. So you can have that basic Teams training, for example, covered by learning pathways. And Viva Learning, that's an element that's coming from Microsoft, which will help in this space as well, in learning and training and keeping that material fresh. And these assets, I should mention, and these playlists can be customized. You can add in your own training too, in with the Microsoft provided ones. So it's a helpful way to communicate some of these changes. And finally here, to keep the roadmap fresh, to keep it evolved, one of the things that you want to do is recognize things that you've delivered, wins. If you're getting feedback from people, celebrate that, make that part of your roadmap reviews. It can help encourage and motivate as well. So we're at the end here. And, in summary, hopefully what you've taken away from this is that a roadmap is not a final static document. It's a living document expected to change. Keep it up to date, keep it fresh. And spending a bit of time following the process, going through assessment, visioning, building out the roadmap, iterating is really helpful to create one that's useful to your organization and specific to your organization. And evolve it, keep your eye on what's happening in the platform. And have fun with it too. They don't have to be static, boring, dry. Use your brand, make it yours, and have fun with that. There is a blog post we have, so you can check that out if you want more detail, more info. This presentation and the recording as well will be shared. You can check out the official roadmap for Microsoft 365. And if you need any help with the materials or the slide deck used in the visioning workshop, for example, just reach out to me. Happy to share anything that might help you. And with that, I will pause. If we have any questions, happy to answer that, talk about that.
Yeah, we have one question here, Jazz, with regards to involving the records management team and involving records management as part of the roadmap, and kind of knowing that things can get out of control pretty quickly with your teams and SharePoint sites, and making sure you get in front of that. Can you speak to a little bit of how you've done that in the past?
Yes. So definitely, if you can, involve records management in planning every roadmap. Maybe they're part of your Microsoft 365 committee, and they should be involved in that in the current state assessment, so understanding the problems and being part of the interview, and as well as part of the visioning workshop, and then reviewing the changes. In terms of sprawl and governance, that's a whole other topic. But one thing that I like to think about is if we're piloting things, then that way we can take some lessons learned. So for example, if we're piloting Teams with the Teams workspaces with SharePoint behind the scenes to just a specific group, that will help mitigate some of that sprawl and rolling it out sort of department by department if possible. You also want to roll this out in conjunction if you're already using SharePoint and you've already classified documents, you've spent some time invested in your metadata, then you're going to want to take that approach where you're rolling it out department by department. So that matches what people are seeing in SharePoint, and documents and information is classified, whether it's coming from Teams or whether it's coming from SharePoint. You want to roll that out in that pilot model. Hope that answers the question. Anything you would add, Michael?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I would say too, like, this person is kind of commenting on the sprawl of Teams and SharePoint and stuff like that. So I guess to I think maybe take away from today's session would be that, hey, it's never too late to get started on your roadmap, and you can kind of just assume that your current state is just what previously has been done. But certainly kind of getting ahead of your planning and how you're going to move forward and how you're going to adjust course if need be would certainly be a big value for this exercise.
Excellent.
Are there any other burning questions that anyone had on the webinar today? So a Q&A button in the upper right-hand corner you can go to and type in your questions.
I don't see anything, I don't think. I'm just opening up the Q&A panel here. Yes, if you have any other questions about who's involved, how long it takes, or want any tips, feel free to reach out to me. I'm definitely happy to chat about roadmaps. And so while we wrap up, I will give a little plug here for the next ARMA Canada conference. This is a premier conference for records managers and information professionals in Canada. So we're really excited, again, to be participating this year. Just to get everyone even more excited, we're giving away a free pass for this conference. So the conference is happening on May 31st to June 2nd. It's 3 days. And so if you do want a pass or you want to try your hand at getting a pass, you can follow, share, like on our various socials, LinkedIn and Twitter.
Did have a great question come in. Sorry, guys, from Andrew
perfect.
about, hey, how do you get around the analysis paralysis when building the roadmap, especially in complex environments with many dependencies, both technical, otherwise? I'm going to guess politics and personalities in that mix too.
Right. Yes. I mentioned, and I undersold it a bit, but it does require some iteration for sure. I've never worked on a roadmap that doesn't have that's right the first time, for example, or realistic the first time. So expect to iterate it. In terms of analysis paralysis, because generally it's we're setting this up as a project. Sometimes we're coming in as consultants. We have a sort of beginning and start date, and so that's a benefit sometimes of setting it up that way with a project. Maybe you have an external person doing it, is that there is a limited amount of time. So as work fills the vacuum of time it has. So time boxing things is a helpful way of heading off some of that analysis paralysis. Internally in organizations, when I've worked as part of product teams, it can get spiral out, or lots of things can come into play, and maybe you're getting really detailed. And so stepping back, I find, and trying to present it in a one pager like I've shown examples today can help you focus on the really key things. They don't need to be super detailed right out of the gate. So trying to get yourself out of the weeds would be my other tip.
And I think certainly slicing and dicing it into the themes and outcomes and products and stuff like that is a way just to get those individual constituent areas of the roadmap into bite-sized chunks that you can kind of digest, and just focusing on getting clarity around those areas.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. I think we've covered all the questions, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm perfect. I think we'll wrap it up there. I'm just off to get my vaccine, so wish me luck, and we'll see you hopefully at the ARMA conference and at our next webinar. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.